Welcome to The State of Us. Real people with honest opinions and the future of responsible media. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Socialism and nationalism both seem to be on the rise as politicians like President Donald Trump and Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren perpetuate these ideas. But it isn't the first time that they've been used or suggested as solutions to economic ills. In fact, the Wall Street Journal in a review article says, quote, socialism and right-wing nationalism are popping up all over the world, both motivated by economic insecurity and discontent. So today, we're going to talk about how nationalism and socialism aren't necessarily new ideas. In fact, we've used them before in this very country to overcome various types of issues that we've faced. The question about why do you care is Lance and I have determined that probably for at least the last 20 years, we've been in kind of this limbo state, not really embracing either of them and returning to a time before the 1920s where things were a little bit more free for all, if you will. And what we're looking at today is there's obviously discontent, hence President Donald Trump and the lots of language and millions of people who supported individuals like Bernie Sanders in recent elections and who will probably do so again in upcoming elections. So you care because this goes to the fabric of our economy, which speaks to the well-being and general quality of life for literally pretty much every American. So there's a lot of different angles you could care from, but it's something that ultimately affects all of us, some more than others, but isn't something that we can run from. Of course, we can't begin a conversation on nationalism and socialism without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, and while it's a history lesson of sorts today, it's also then what direction do we take from this point forward? Right. So it's yes, we're going to look back a little bit and talk about how we got here. But then the bigger question is, okay, where do we go from here? When we can't recreate what we had, so some form or fashion of new economy and new social order will take place. And the better we understand what direction we will go, the better you can plan for the future and how to best position yourself to live the rest of your life.
And determining what
to me, that's the big thing. I mean, that's really what we're talking about here.
And if you're going to determine the direction, if there's evidence and, case studies in the past where we've tried certain things before, it's worth examining them. Because hopefully it lets you, it's that whole know the past so you can avoid the mistakes that others have made. And I think that's exactly part of why we're going to spend some time looking at that today. Before we dive into that, and I'm going to kind of hand it over to Lance for that part of it, but before we get to that, I did want to take a second to reiterate something, which is that socialism and nationalism are both motivated by economic insecurity and discontent. That's a line from the Wall Street Journal article we're referencing. If you want to follow along with it, go to thestateofus.org, thestateofus.org. You can check it out. But the reason that line to me is so important, Lance, is because the reason that we're seeing both of these stems from the same root challenges and issues that we're facing. In other words, and here's where I want to be careful too, they are different answers, but they don't have to be. What I mean by that is right now, you say Donald Trump, and one of the things that you might think of is nationalism. And you say Bernie Sanders, and one of the things you might think of is socialism. And the challenge there is that we do that and we assume that it's one or the other. But part of what I think we're going to look at from a historical standpoint is it isn't always one or the other, and nor does it have to be. In other words, it's not you're either socialist or nationalist. There are even world history examples of where you look at countries that used a blend of both, or are using a blend of both. So we're gonna dive into that more. And in many
cases, so is the United States.
Right, exactly.
Which is where we're hoping to show you in today's show, is that these don't have to be antagonist within our political structure and our economic structure that these two can come together and work and make a better America. And that understanding will take us further as a country instead of separating us if we can come to a common ground and a common understanding about what both of these terms mean and how they affect us economically as well as socially.
And that's why we're going to look at the history component, because I think too often, and this is something we discuss all the time on the show, Lance, is this whole notion that it's either or, right? Mm-hmm. I'm either a Republican or a Democrat. I'm either a socialist or a nationalist. And so often, more often than not, it seems we would be benefited by not thinking in those stark black and white type of terms.
Exactly.
Because we lose the nuance and the ability to take the best of both worlds. So without further ado, let's dive in a little bit, Lance, to the history component.
Well, if you go back 100 years, the United States was coming out of World War I and things looked rosy. We had been able to fight in that war without really getting involved and coming out on top, on the winning side. And things looked good. The world needed things. And so American businesses and farmers went into debt to create all this stuff to sell overseas. And it was a time when big corporations were doing extremely well and the workers not so well. And that led to, strong nationalist fervor, being successful in a war and thinking things were going to continue on an upward mobile movement forever. And then the stock market crash, which basically showed everybody that, oh, wow, what we thought was happening really wasn't happening. And then financial institutions crashing and people losing their faith in everything. And this happening all over the world. It wasn't just in the United States. So there weren't places that could come in and help us or where we could seek help.
And what time are we in now?
Well, that was the late 20s, early 1930s.
Okay.
Which led to the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt as president of the United States. And what his supporters would say, in order to save the United States and democracy, he and his people began to put the government in place of the big corporations to provide Social Security, to create jobs, to do all of those things. And he wasn't very successful. The government found out that it could not operate. Yet people were better off, but things really weren't getting stronger under FDR. As far as the economy was concerned. And then we had the outbreak of war in Europe again, what is generally referred to as the Second World War. Most historians look at it as just a continuation of World War I because things really weren't taken care of properly at the end of World War I. And
things just kind of came to a pause.
Right. and then that created jobs. Mm-hmm. Not that wars will always do that, but as some people like to point out, they want to argue that, well, we just have a war to create jobs and everything would be great. I mean, you don't always want that. But in this case, it did put Americans back to work, trying to defeat the Germans and the Japanese. And then coming out of that war, again, the United States on top, but many problems facing the country economically, because now how do you return to a peacetime economy after a war? And we were very much in debt. The war cost lots and lots of money, millions and millions of dollars. And so there were two schools of thought. One, for business and corporations to take over, or for the government to step back in. And at that time, the president, upon the death of FDR at the end of World War II, was Harry S. Truman. And he became what most people, Bernie would say, was the first chance for Medicare for all. That,
so Bernie before Bernie.
Yes. I mean, and this idea of insurance for everybody isn't a 21st century idea. This was something that Truman and his people proposed in the late 40s, early 50s to help ease the pain of coming out of the war into a peacetime economy. However, the other opportunity was for American businesses to rise from the ashes of the Great Depression, that they had stimulated the economy because they were making war products, and now to turn into, here was an opportunity to provide the rest of the world where the war had been fought with many of the things that are necessary to live: infrastructure, bridges, roads, schools, hospitals, along with food, medicine, clothing, all kinds of opportunities here for the businesses. And so then what we saw happen was there was a struggle here. Corporations won out, and the American worker did extremely well. And then as the article points out, and I'll let you take over here, the idea then that the corporation became the social structure of the United States.
Right.
And this would have been the time when my parents were active and your grandparents were active in the economy.
Right. Well, and this is the interesting thing. I'm going to plug, for what it's worth, a book that Lance and I don't think either of us have finished it yet, but we're closing in. It's called Capitalism in America, A History, and you can get it on Amazon or, any place that you find books. And it's co-authored, but Alan Greenspan, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve from 1987 to 2006, is one of the authors. And part of what I think it does a good job of without directly addressing is this very thing that Lance and I are looking at, which is this notion, that everything's all one or the other. For example, it looks at the FDR period, and I think the way that most Americans who know something about FDR look back is, oh, he was this really successful president. The question is, what does that mean? He was very successful in terms of, I think, his image and appearance and what people thought of him and who they saw him as, and they believed he was successful. When you look at a lot of his policies and things that he tried to do, some are so-so, in terms of did they really have the impact that we perceive him having as a president?
Well, I think he probably really helped save American democracy.
Sure.
But he didn't turn around the economy.
No.
And people try to say, well, he saved the United States and he made the economy better. And he really didn't. And
that's part of what we're going to look at going forward here is the kind of the pros and cons of this era. So we're going to pick up in just a second with, what happens when my grandparents were active in the economy and this move away from socialism, kind of into nationalism and what that meant and how we navigated that. Because it's all relevant to, what we're debating right now, which is today in 2019, socialism or nationalism. And of course, like many things, Lance and I are saying it's probably not either. It's probably some form or some pieces of both, depending on what we decide we're trying to accomplish. So we're going to talk more about that. But remember, you can read this article. And I think we'll also maybe, Lance, create a space on the State of Us website for books, because you and I read a lot of books and, we talk about them. So I think it would make sense, don't you, for our listeners to have access to know kind of what's on our reading list that's pertinent to the State of Us.
Yeah, most definitely.
I mean, why not? I think this book is very informative, and some of these are going to be, they're not super fast reads necessarily, but I think it's nice for you to be able to see what Lance and I are. But others
are lighthearted and comedic and uplifting. Well, yep. we have a wide variety of things that we read that affect, I think, this show.
Yep, absolutely. So check out thestateofus.org. We're adding stuff there all the time, both articles and resources. You can find all the different ways to listen to our program, both as a podcast and syndicated radio program. And we'll look at various different options to continue to build out that resource, but your engagement's important. So check out social media links there to stay involved with the State of Us and give us your input. We really do care about it. So we're going to continue talking about socialism and nationalism. Both are the old answer to common economic ills of today, but are they the right answer? That's what we're looking at. Stay with us and we'll be right back.
We are the State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Socialism and nationalism both seem to be on the rise, Lance, as politicians like President Donald Trump and Senator Bernie Sanders perpetuate these ideas. We've looked so far at some of the historical context that neither of these two individuals really are bringing forward novel concepts. Even Medicare for all, right? It was already proposed once upon a time. And it didn't It didn't happen. But we already looked at it, and our politicians in America already went through it. So Lance has shared with us kind of late 1800s all the way up through, 1940s or so?
To about the 1950s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s, yes.
Yeah. And
we were just getting into that.
Right.
That time when General Motors, what was good for General Motors was good for the United States, and what was good for the United States was good for General Motors.
Fallacy of composition. What's good
periods.
For one, good for the others.
That's
or
right.
Good for the group.
Well, and that notion is referenced in so many things, Lance, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that became, and by the way, that quote that Lance just shared was actually said by the president of General Motors at the time, because he really did believe that. And at that time, and this is the key, this is what we're talking about now, at that time, it was true. What kind of happened is, because this goes back to what we talked about before, the either or, this idea that socialism and business are mutually exclusive things.
Well, we weren't going to have FDR's government programs. So in its place stepped up the big U.S. corporations and the factories where workers were asked to give their life to the factory to become a company man. Mm-hmm. And in return, they would get lifelong employment. They would get annual raises. They would get health insurance,
pension,
life insurance, a pension when they retired at the age of 65, and a place to eat lunch and to work out. And basically then their entire social structure, as well as their economic structure, was taken care of by the big corporation. And in return, then they were asked not to go out on their own, not to try to be intellectually creative and start a business in competition with the company that they were working for. And so, and it benefited everybody because we could make all kinds of things and items to sell around the world, which in turn made more money for the company, which then the company turned around and gave to the workers, and everybody was, quote, satisfied.
Yep. Well, and
until that kind of gave out, and then another option came in, and it was like, hey, those people who own stocks, you big corporations, you owe them something, because here you've been sharing the wealth with your workers. Well, you now owe your investors money. And so then we saw a change and an economic downturn in the 70s. And out of that came a change where corporations kind of decided we owe our investors money, not our employees money. And so, and since I'm not going to be protected by the big corporation, I'm going to job hop and find my best job, and I'm going to create these small businesses that create money for me and mine because nobody's looking out for me. And big business said, I'm not going to look out for the workers. I'm going to look out for my investors. And the way we invested and began to change. And now if you invested, the stock market's doing great. You're doing well. But if you're a worker, unless you are part of one of these companies that your idea caught on, you're struggling. But that was historically, that was the change. We looked at it and people said, we're going to change the way we do things now.
Yep. Well, and the thing that I think is interesting is sometimes what people forget is the modern corporation as we know it. And what I mean by that is the legal entity was born out of a very similar idea to government in that initially pretty much all corporations had a set of bylaws, right? Mm-hmm. Essentially their version of a constitution.
Right.
What are we here for? What are we trying to do? What are the rules that are going to govern our operations? And it was this thing, the idea became that existed in perpetuity. In other words, much like the government is not contingent on any one person in our government, right? The government is an ongoing, perpetual organization. It doesn't cease to exist just because a single person goes away. In fact, we have all sorts of layering specifically set up to avoid it ever being fully dependent on any given person. And corporations were structured much the same way. So the whole point of bringing all this up, I think, is to remind people that the idea that when we pushed into nationalism post World War II and we sold this idea of the American dream, and I'm saying that with air quotes that you can't see, we didn't abandon socialism. It just changed forms, and we offloaded that responsibility from the government and said, well, we're going to kind of hand that over to the corporations now. So it's not that it went away and that we decided it was a bad idea. It's that as the economy shifted, so too we said, who's going to deliver our version of the welfare state is going to be the corporation. Because
who the corporation benefited were mostly white males.
Right.
And it didn't really do much for women or minorities and wasn't set up to do such. Mm-hmm. And so as the face of the country changed, then we hear other things as well. So yes, it helped. That's why those people who support Donald Trump in those days, let's go back to that, typically,
because by most measures it worked well for
are
them.
White males. That's who it worked well for.
Right.
And if you're female and minorities, well, the government programs and the government saying we're not going to be racist or economically dependent on any certain group and we're going to spread the wealth around to everybody, that gets us to where we are today politically when you look at who supports these two ideas. But as we've stated, and hopefully are proving to you, they are more in common than they are apart. We've just seen an ebb and flow of these two ideas over the last 100 years.
Yeah. And that's where part of why I like doing this program so much, Lance, is because there's all these things. It's not that you didn't have the information to know it before, because I think for a lot of people, right? I mean, as we're talking about, hopefully there's some semblance of, I kind of remember learning this in school, maybe not to the same detail, but the generalities of FDR and what he did. And then when Truman came on the scene,
I maybe remember there was a question on a test one time about the fair deal.
Yeah.
The fair deal or the New Deal, New Deal being FDR, fair deal being Truman.
Yeah. And then the American dream and when it came about and what it was. And then the discussion about, does it still exist? And I think the neat thing about doing the State of Us, and hopefully for those of you listening, is it's not that what we learned was necessarily wrong. It's that we now have the opportunity to come to different conclusions based on the information and put it in context that actually helps us today, right? It's not just examine all this history stuff for no reason. The reason that we're talking about all of this is because I think that for most people, me included, these connections weren't necessarily made before. That socialism, nationalism, maybe nationalism more so, because I guess I associated that some with post-World War II stuff, but that may just be me. But the socialism thing, we don't name it that way. And maybe that's a teaching thing. Side note on education, Lance, I guess an earmark that we need to make sure we name what these things were. And maybe us talking about that will help. Well, and maybe help too, make that happen.
For me, it's the negative connotation of both words.
Yeah.
By the people who are from the different group and realize, no, we've kind of been both and have kind of melded those two ideas together to where we are today. And then me being the eternal optimist that I am is that this isn't new, folks. Mm-hmm. People are like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen in the United States? We're going to fall apart. It's like, no, we're right now, I believe, living in that state of flux that they lived in post World War II during the 1970s, that I remember late 70s, early 80s economically when things were tough. And this is normal if you study this time period of this state of what I'm calling a state of flux, state of, we're not sure which direction we're going to go, is normal within the economic history of the United States.
I want to take a second to bring in Caleb because I want to see what somebody who, I don't know, I guess their feathers aren't ruffled quite as much the same way that Lance and I's are by this type of thing. I'm interested to get his perspective, but I think it's important too to lay out just from a purely definition standpoint. Okay. Socialism is a noun and it means a political and economic theory of social organization, which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. So most of what we talk about, okay, is in regards to regulated by the community as a whole, as opposed to owned. Yes, I think there's some instances where we would discuss, the government, i.e. the government owns, the space of, welfare for the most part nowadays, because organizations mostly don't mess with that much. In other words, I'm talking about things like unemployment, food stamps, these types of things. The government owns that area and fully controls it. But then you have other things like minimum wage and so forth that it regulates, but are not exclusive to it because businesses operate in conjunction with it. And then you bring in nationalism, and this is where you talk about on its purest level. Okay. So we're not talking about extreme nationalism, right-wing nationalism, just nationalism as a word, as a noun, is the identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially when to the detriment of the interest of other nations. So think about wartime, right? We're going to war for World War II. Nationalism makes a whole lot of sense right about then because we're going to war. Right? We can't be thinking about everybody else. We have to be putting our own interests ahead of theirs. And we have to have that mentality if you're going to win. You're going out to play your soccer match, right, Lance? And we're getting ready. We can't really be thinking about the other team and their feelings, and not beating them, too bad or being too mean to them, because then you're probably not going to win if you're worried about all that. So the point is there's a practicality to these things. And the reason we experienced them was typically a relatively natural reaction to what was going on at the time. So Caleb, give us quickly here in your 30-second, 1 minute tidbit. What are you making of what we're saying? Is this something, does it make sense based on your previous knowledge? And are you making a connection that you haven't made before?
Well, number one, you couldn't have picked a better time to talk about this because in our macroeconomics class, we are actually looking at socialism and capitalism, or market economy as it relates to business and wealth. So I'm relatively familiar with the definitions of each. What I'm learning right now is not to worry, because we've been through this before. We've been in the situation of a nationalism versus socialism, and with socialism on the rise, we've been here before, and so there's no need to panic. I do agree though that there should be a balance of both, because as we talked about with, is the U.S. a democracy or a republic? We determined that it was a balance of both, and that was better for the nation. So I think in the same situation here, there are certain aspects of socialism that could benefit the United States. There are certain aspects of nationalism that could benefit the United States. And there are certain benefits of capitalism that could benefit the United States. So kind of a three-way blend would be most beneficial here.
And none of them, and this is the big key that I'm hoping to drive home to people, none of them are mutually exclusive, okay? I think since our inception, tell me if you disagree, Lance, the whole idea of our nation has been that we're not one or the other. So much of what we're about is the opportunity for different ideas, different people to coexist in a common space and use the differences to achieve hopefully the best possible scenario. Now, whether or not that's always accomplished is a totally different thing, because we frequently, I think, make decisions that outweigh and totally benefit one group over the other. But our idea is, I don't know.
I've been reading a lot recently of our founding fathers. And so from the 1760s to the 1860s. And boy, I don't know. I'm not sure we realized what we were doing, how we were trying to bring in all these different people under one roof. And that's why we have these struggles, is because we have taken basically at least 3, if not 5 different, what could easily be different countries, because they're different regions of our country that have different motivating factors in their economy and in their societies, and tried to bring them under one roof, which is why we have so many problems. But economically, until we got to FDR, we were practicing what I would call the truest form of capitalism. And that is, you made money or you didn't make money, and everything was dependent upon you, and you didn't have too much control over the economy unless you were the owners.
think we were a lot more libertarian too.
So, very much so. But a part of that was because we were spread out and government wasn't seen as people wanting the government to influence their lives.
Well, because for the most part, it wasn't something they encountered even on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
I mean, most of your roads were dirt. Most roads weren't sanctioned roads. They just were there because that was the most logical path to follow.
I think what you described is 20th century American history and the 20th and 21st American history. Economics and politics. I'm not so sure the first 125 years would fit into what you described, but most definitely the last 125 years would.
Let me clarify and give something people to think about for a second. I'm not sure, I like what you said. I'm not sure that our founding fathers fully understood the implications of what they were putting down. In other words, how much can what Lance and I say today, how much can we anticipate what somebody 200 years from now will make of our ideals? And what they put down, they may not have realized the implications of how somebody today would look at it and say, well, that means that we're for X, Y, and Z, right? And maybe that's part of where we run into trouble in history, is remembering that the lens they were looking at it through is different than we look at it through today. So keep that in mind, because that's the whole, we inadvertently put our ideals into people's intentions from the past, when in reality, they may not have been that way. But that doesn't make them any less pertinent, right? I mean,
exactly.
The Constitution still says what it says, type of thing, right? So how we interpret it may change, but it still says what it says. And maybe that's part of the beauty of it, is that it is in the eyes of the beholder to an extent. So keep thinking about that. Nationalism, socialism, they're not as different as you might think, and nor are they mutually exclusive. We've been talking about that and kind of the history component so far, and we're about to look at, so where do we go from here? What do we do with this information? But before we do that, we're going to take a brief moment, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Socialism and nationalism. President Donald Trump, Senator Bernie Sanders. These are names you might hear that commonly get associated with these two ideas and principles. But let's not forget, as we've examined so far today, that we've tried both of them in the past, and they've both served different purposes. Now, an important caveat there is in both cases, they've left people behind or excluded people. Nationalism, I think, has a tendency to do that a little bit more, Lance, than socialism, because the very nature of socialism is this idea of the greater good, right? The benefit of the whole body.
Right.
Where nationalism, and this is why, again, I don't think it's fair to say they're two opposites, because they're not. The opposite of socialism would be like free market economy or something like that. Nationalism isn't necessarily an economic principle as much as it is a national ideology type of thing, a mode of operation more than it is a specific economic principle.
But then when you base your economics on that principle of belief.
Exactly. So what we left off before we got to this part was talking a little bit about this whole notion that so often we talk about, well, what did our founding fathers mean? I don't think that that's irrelevant by any means, Lance, to examine that, because again, much like we're talking about today, examining the past can help us avoid making some of the same mistakes. At the same time, we have to think about how what we have, what our founding documents say, which have survived a very, very long time, are practical in today's world. How do we use them in a way that makes sense today?
Well, but like you said, we can use either one, nationalism or socialism, and fit into the Constitution.
Exactly.
We've done it in the past, and we will do it in the future. And it just comes down to, where do people want to put their faith? Is it in the big corporation, or is it in the government? And I think that becomes, to just narrow it down, that's where it is. Okay. Do you want to trust big business and to make sure your life is better, or do you want to trust the government to make sure your life is better? That's what I see as the difference. And what we've done is we vacillate. We go back and forth between those two ideas and those two concepts. And right now, we're living in a time when we're doing everything we can to help business grow. And those people who believe in that think that's going to bring everybody else in on its coattails.
At the same time, though, we've weakened things like unions that provide the workers the ability to regulate how far the business can go.
Because we're trusting in the big corporation. Okay. Unions are a socialist idea where you let the workers have a collective bargaining agreement, and you hope the government then steps in with a minimum wage and all of those kinds of things. So if it just depends on where you see. I think another difference though is when we had the big business as well as unions, you also had a business tax rate that was at least twice to three times what it is now.
People forget that.
We were in debt. And so with businesses booming, the government began to tax businesses. Now the leaning of the government is to make it easier for big business to make more and more money, which is then not conducive to the worker doing well. At the same time, with the demise of the labor union, which is interesting, as we're doing the show anyway right now, GM is on one of the biggest strikes it's been on in the last 10 or 15 years.
Right.
But that's one of the outliers of the labor union movement. And it's in direct correlation to not liking the direction of the big corporations right now. So it's kind of a socialist movement with the labor unions. So again, but we're going to find our path. You know, like Caleb said earlier in his economics class in high school, we've been here before. We're going to find a path. We may not take exactly the same path as we have before, but we're going to find some common ground and bring along the majority of the people. Because if you don't, then you'll have what FDR feared, and that was a possible overthrow of the government. The government has to step in at some point and do what's best for the masses so that we can keep the country rolling.
Whether that's a 90% corporate tax rate, no corporate tax rate, the welfare state, the point is all of these, as we've examined, are not mutually exclusive things. And in fact, the very terms socialism and nationalism were kind of born out of labeling things that were interconnected. In other words, we experienced socialism and nationalism at the same time. And they're not opposites. Because they're not really in the same wheelhouse in terms of they're different ideas and different components. And hopefully what we've explained today is they're both an old answer to the problem that we're facing today. And old doesn't make it wrong, but I think we have to be very careful about just re-embracing the same path that we already followed, which is what Lance laid out in the beginning, right? We were in this deregulated state before the recession. And then we went into socialism following the recession. And you kind of look at the ACA, right? Obamacare. Right. I mean, that was the beginning of that type of thing. Right. The expansion of the welfare state. And then, right, you kind of get the kickback and you move kind of toward nationalism. The difference is all of this has happened at an accelerated pace, right? We went with Obama and now we're with Trump. And now we're navigating in this next election. What do we want? And I think the answer,
it's a good way to put it,
is we don't probably want either extreme. Because at the end of the day, as we've learned from history, typically those don't serve everybody the best.
Extremes work in the short term, but they're not good long-range solutions.
Yep. And unfortunately, the compromise in the middle ground is usually not as sexy. But that doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do. So we're challenging you to think about, what is the right path forward? Do you disagree? Maybe the moderate approach isn't right. Maybe you can make the strong case that we need one or the other, or we need strong nationalism and socialism simultaneously. And that's not that far-fetched, like we highlighted. It's literally happened before. So it's not crazy. So let us know your thoughts. Thestateofus.org, thestateofus.org. And remember, you can read this full article in the Wall Street Journal we're referencing. And I think Lance seemed to really like the idea about our reading lists. So I think we're gonna put that there. And by the time you tune into this, that feature should be available for you. So be sure to check that out too. You can get a little bit deeper into how Lance and I arrive at some of what we think about. And hopefully you'll come up with some different ideas, because that's the whole point of what we do, right, Lance?
Exactly.
Speaking of which, what is TrueChat's mission? What are we trying to do here today?
Is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
Okay. So I think we did that. Tell us if we didn't. And there's a lot of different ways people can tune in, especially now. And it's important that you're aware of them, because we're challenging you to bring in other people. Part of what makes our whole idea effective, that mission that you just heard effective, is bringing in more individuals to this conversation. So what are the ways people can listen, Lance?
Got a new listener last week. She asked me, are you guys on Spotify? And I said, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and wherever else you can find good podcasts. And so
almost like it's scripted.
Yeah, that's what they said.
Good podcast?
Yeah, good podcast.
Not
we've
fine
dropped from
podcast.
fine to good.
Hey, it was a different show.
Okay.
All right.
It was a
Any
different
place
show.
you can find fine podcast.
All right. For the State of Us on TrueChat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
And I'm Caleb Spinner.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change.